Mr. Stoltenberg, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be in there and asking you some questions, because it's not like a sunny days in relations between Russia and NATO. Let me start with the problems first, and then we go to the common issues. How would you call the conditions where we now? I mean, NATO and Russia. It's like a political tense or maybe Cold War?
We are not in a Cold War situation because during the Cold War it was very different. We had two military blocs, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, standing against each other, and with hundreds of thousands of troops, nuclear weapons in Europe, and a very different situation. But we have a difficult relationship, and we have seen that after the end of the Cold War, tensions went down and we improved the relationship between Russia and NATO. Now we have seen a deterioration in the relationship, especially after the illegal annexation of Crimea and Russia's continued support for the separatists in eastern Ukraine. NATO do not want confrontation with Russia. NATO does not want a new Cold War. We don't want an arms race. Actually, we will continue to strive for a more constructive and cooperative relationship with Russia. And I know, as a Norwegian politician, that it is possible to have a pragmatic working relationship with Russia, because Norway was able to develop that with the Soviet Union and later on with Russia. So I will continue to work for a more constructive relationship between NATO and Russia.
You've just mentioned two blocs and forces on the border, but the fact is that NATO tanks right now are closer than ever in the NATO history to Russian border. I've seen actually the map outside the studio, and Crimea is Ukrainian still on your map. That is the only reason for tanks on our border, or you have another one? What is the message of this?
No one in NATO planned or discussed or thought about the idea of deploying NATO forces to the three NATO allied countries, the Baltic countries and to Poland, before Russia annexed Crimea and before Russia started to destabilize eastern Ukraine. So there is no doubt that NATO's presence in the eastern part of the alliance is a direct consequence of Russia's aggression against Ukraine, because NATO allies became afraid that something similar could happen to one of them, as they saw in Ukraine. And to make sure that NATO continue to provide the necessary deterrence, we have decided to increase our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. But our presence is defensive, it's proportionate, and it's a measured presence. We have battalions, and I know that Russia have divisions on the other side of the border. The three Baltic countries are independent sovereign nations, member of NATO. Poland is an independent sovereign nation. They ask us to be present there, they welcome us, and we have responded positively with a modest defensive presence, directly triggered by the Russia aggression against Ukraine.
Just for full understanding, tanks is going to be on the border until Russia will give or send Crimea back to Ukraine, do you think?
We have decided that this is a necessary response to the behavior of Russia against Ukraine, because NATO's military presence is not there to provoke a conflict, sure, but we are there to prevent the conflict. And we learned during the Cold War period that as long as NATO stands united, as long as we behave in a predictable, reasonable, defensive way, we are able to prevent the war. And we did that successfully for decades during the Cold War, and we are in a very different situation now, but for NATO it's important to continue to send a message to all potential adversaries that NATO is there to protect all allies. An attack on one ally will trigger a response for the whole alliance. At the same time, I know that there is no conflict, no contradiction between defense and dialogue. As long as NATO is firm, defensive and predictable, we can also engage with in a political dialogue with Russia. And I welcome very much that we have been able to convene again meetings in the NATO-Russia Council. We have met with Russia, we have discussed difficult issues. Dialogue is not always easy, but that's actually make the dialogue important, because we address difficult issues like Ukraine. We address the importance of transparency, predictability in military relations to avoid incidents, accidents. We saw the downing of the Russian plane over Turkey in 2015. We have to avoid anything like that from happening again. And we have discussed also Afghanistan and other issues. So I strongly believe in dialogue with Russia, especially when the relations are difficult as they are now. Then it's even more important to sit down and talk.
Thanks for that, because the situation is conflict and discussion and dialogue. And let me ask you about dialogue, about common issues. There are Afghanistan, as I understand, and fighting terrorism. What else, and what we can do together to fight terrorism all around the world, and how we can fight ISIS in Afghanistan?
Well, first of all, I believe it is important to have a dialogue with Russia on many different issues. And one of the issues we have discussed with Russia is what we call transparency, on military activities, exercises and so on, because we have to avoid incidents, accidents from happening, and if they happen, to prevent them from spiraling out of control. And now we are working together with Russia on, for instance, air safety in the Baltic Sea region. This is an initiative, Finnish initiative, and NATO allies, NATO allied countries, Russia met in Helsinki some weeks ago to address that issue. Okay. NATO has suspended practical cooperation with Russia after the illegal annexation of Crimea, but we continue to work for transparency, risk reduction in the military domain. We think it's important that all nations contribute to the fight against terrorism, but the challenge in Syria is, of course, that we see that Russia's presence in Syria is not only about fighting terrorism, it's also very much about supporting the Assad regime, and we regard the Assad regime responsible for atrocities, for killing of civilians, and therefore we also regret that Russia is supporting the Assad regime.
NATO as an organization is going to involve in Syria conflict, or just EU participants by countries?
No, NATO as an alliance doesn't have any plans to be directly involved in the conflict in Syria. We are not present in Syria. NATO allies are, as you know, the United States, Turkey, other allies are engaged in Syria in the fight against ISIL or Daesh. But NATO provides some support to the efforts of the coalition fighting ISIL both in Iraq and in Syria. We have our AWACS surveillance planes help improving the air picture for the coalition fighting ISIL. And we do some training of Iraqi officers, but we are not present in Syria.
Would you describe me? NATO members are planning to carry out military drills involving Russian-speaking figurant in Bavaria in a few days. NATO is preparing for some action. Why do you use Russian-speaking figurants in your drills?
Well, this is not a NATO exercise. What I have been told is that this is a US exercise or activity.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, but I have also been informed that they have asked for people with also language skills from many different kinds of language skills from many different countries. So this is nothing, let's say, dangerous or aggressive. This is about that when they have an international activity, they have people speaking many different languages as part of that activity. But I think it's the best thing is that the US explains exactly what this is, because this is a US activity, not a NATO activity.
Okay, and the last thing, Mr. Secretary, it's not completely NATO question, but I have to ask you, because I've read your tweet about the tragedy with OSCE SMM monitors in Lugansk region. You've written, let me quote, "Safety and freedom of movement must be maintained." Do you or your partners have any plan on the table how to reach that goal?
I think it's very important to support the efforts of the OSCE in eastern Ukraine, because they are so important for all attempts or all the work to try to find a peaceful, negotiated solution to the conflict in eastern Ukraine. And the only way forward is to fully respect the ceasefire, the withdrawal of heavy weapons, and to make sure that that happens, we need the international OSCE monitors. And this is very serious that we now have seen that the monitors are not able to move freely around. They need full, free, safe access to the whole region. This is the first time we have seen one of the monitors being killed. It happened in the separatist-controlled part of eastern Ukraine, and therefore I support the initiative by the OSCE to look into the case, to have an investigation and to find out exactly what happened, because we have to make sure that these kind of things cannot happen again. Ukraine is a partner, it's a close partner of NATO.
I've seen Ukrainian officer here.
Yes, because Ukraine is a close partner, and we work with Ukraine. We help them with modernize their defense and security sector. We have different trust funds. We work with Ukraine in many different ways. And of course, for NATO, it is of great concern that we see continued violations of the ceasefire. And we are also deeply concerned about the fact that one of the international observers were killed when they conducted a very important activity to inspect and observe the situation in eastern Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Mr. General Secretary, for this opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.